Overlord. Volume 14, Chapter 2, Countdown to Extinction, Part 2a. The children, upon seeing that Brain had returned, ran towards him. "OS-san, you're back. OS-san, OS-san." TL's note, an informal form of Aji-san, a weird middle ground between old man, sir, uncle, etc. So there is no direct English analog. The 10 children surrounded Brain, 9 boys and a girl. They were all orphans. Brain had taken those who he had believed to have some sort of potential, allowed them to live with him, and were training them in the art of swordsmanship. Because they grew up in a rough environment, they fully understood the importance of violent force and were able to keep up with his harsh training regimen. Having said that, they were still just children, so Brain was still unsure if they could meet his expectations. Surely if they continued to train like this, they would be able to, at the very least, reach Climb's level. The children stunk of sweat, but it wasn't offensive to Brain. After all, he would be the same after training. This was proof that the children had been working hard. "Oi oi, you guys. Are you done with practice? Break. I practiced so much. My hand." Because they all responded at once, it was hard to fully understand what they were trying to say, but they had completed their practice, that much he did understand. "Now then, go take a break. Remember, I told you guys that breaks are part of training too, right?" The children agreed in a cacophony of noises. "I'll practice with you guys after a while. Do not tell me that you're too tired to practice by then, do you understand?" The children, once again, agreed in a cacophony of noises. "Good. Remember to also fill up on water. Also, don't forget to fill up on salt just because you have been sweating so much." A few of the children said "we get it already" or "OS-san so naggy," but the majority of them replied that they understood. "Good, now go." "Oh, right. Before you go, where are those two?" The oldest of the bunch, their representative, told him, "In the backyard." Brain responded with an "oh," bid goodbye to the children, and walked towards the backyard. The children returned to the house to dine on the food and drinks they had received from the elderly couple who had been expecting them, and to probably take a nap afterwards. Good exercise, good diet, and good sleep. That was how excellent muscles were built. Brain nodded his head in satisfaction. "You made me wait for so long." A woman's voice called out as Brain entered the backyard. "Ah, I'm sorry. I had to prepare in advance to accompany Her Highness the Princess on her meetings with the nobility, merchants, and so on, so I was a bit late." There was a man and a woman there, who had been instructing the children before he arrived. The woman who was speaking to Brain curled up her hair into the shape of a bun, apparently a hairstyle that was called Megai in the south. TL's note, incomplete pronunciation of Maruyama. Her appearance, rather than being what one would usually consider beautiful, gave off the impression that she was icy and acute. She wasn't too tall, perhaps a bit shorter than most women her age. The other person there, the man, remained silent. Though he had an indifferent attitude which could make one think that he was unhappy, that was not the case. He raised a hand as his form of greeting to Brain. He was just not apt at expressing himself. Brain had actually heard him talk quite a few times in the past, but his voice was as quiet as an ant's. The man wasn't too tall either. He had short legs but was otherwise physically fit, but if a rumor was to spread that he had dwarven heritage, he wouldn't have much in the way of a proof against it. The two were both counted in the 6 great disciples of the dojo of the swordsman known as Vesture Croft de Leoin. Brain had his reservations on how they taught. In his mind, his practical swordsmanship training was more useful than their performative swordsmanship practice. Compared to waving air around for a few hundred times, training with a real sword, even if it was a mock sword, was much more effective. Brain believed that his method would allow one to gain more muscle memory than simply exercising one's body. However, This was a good way to allow them to learn the techniques first and build up a foundation solid enough that they would be less likely to die in actual combat. It was hard to say definitively which side was right or wrong. Though they all had gained strength, they had completely different ways of living. It would be troublesome for Brain if the children die in combat before they even had the chance to fully realize their talents. That was why he opted to have the children train with the two, while passing down his own experiences. As a result, the children's training regimen had become harsher. Were their accommodations finalized? Yup, they were finally finalized. They're scheduled to travel northwest with a group of merchants operating in a city close to Council State. The woman frowned a little. It's been 2 weeks since the Sorcerer's Kingdom declared war on us, but there hasn't been news of either country's armies mobilizing. According to some rumors I've heard, the Sorcerer's Kingdom only wants to force the kingdom to back down in some negotiation and does not actually want to fight a full-on war? If that was true, wouldn't that render Mr. Unglaus' efforts in vain? Would that Sorcerer King really do such a thing? If Brain had not met the Sorcerer King in person, he would have believed that this was just a negotiation tactic too. But as a witness to that tragic battle, it was hard for him not to doubt that the Sorcerer King was plotting something. Perhaps he was preparing to cast that spell again. Had Brain's uneasiness spread to her? The woman spoke in a hushed tone. Mr. Unglaus had met with that Sorcerer King. Not only have I met him, I bore witness to his duel with Gazef. I still don't know what happened to Gazef till this day. Her gaze shifted towards Brain's waist. Sheathed by his side was one of the treasures of the kingdom, the razor edge. This was something that was granted to him when the war was declared, even though he had turned it down on numerous occasions. To Brain, this sword was too heavy of a burden for him to bear, so he treated it as something that was entrusted to him for safekeeping only. He did not intend to unsheath the sword. Though this sword was like a hot potato that he would rather pass on to someone else, if that person could not match Gazef Stranov's abilities, he did not intend to just give it away so easily. A duel with Mr. Stranov? She stopped herself before she could complete that sentence. Perhaps she wanted to say something along the lines of, I wish I was there to witness it too. Brain did not think too much of it. After all, she was a warrior too. To wish to bear witness to Gazef's duel was natural for them. No, it was more appropriate to say that he wanted her to witness it too. He had just said that he still could not figure out what had happened during that duel, so if someone else could explain it to him, that would be best. I think the Sorcerer King is plotting something, but I'm not sure what exactly he is plotting. I don't have a basis for that thought after all. My instincts are blaring alarms right now, and I tend to trust my instincts without question. If it's the warrior instincts of someone like Mr. Unglaus, then it just might be true. I'm not too sure on the specifics. Anyways, we have to get these brats out of this place as soon as possible. Even if I die, they could still make a living for themselves with the swordsmanship I've taught them, even if it's not that significant of a skill. Actually, our sensei had told us the same thing as Mr. Unglaus, that the Sorcerer's Kingdom is plotting something in the dark. So when the children are to be sent away, the woman looked towards the silent man next to her. Could you request that he go along with them? What? Would he do that? He glanced at the man, who gave him a silent nod. He appeared to be annoyed, but that was probably not the case. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that this man was patient with children. Though all of the 6 great disciples had been here at some point, the one the children liked the most out of them all was him. Yes, Sensei appeared to have given it some consideration already. As long as he lives, our swordsmanship could continue being passed down through the generations. In other words, they had the same thought as Brain. If that was the case, he had no reason to reject their request. I do not mind as long as your end is fine with it. Having said that, I am grateful for you all. I'll go speak to the merchants who will be taking them away. Brain heard the man say something in his tiny voice, probably something like, please take good care of him or something. Brain raised his hand as a response, to which the man responded in kind by deeply nodding his head. Now then, after the brats have rested up, it'll be my turn to train them. Sorry to have troubled the both of you to train them while I was away. Gratitude was the only thing that flowed out of his mouth. Even though he hadn't paid them much, they still took the time to teach the children. Their sensei Vesture had probably considered the fact that Brain was one who wielded outstanding swordsmanship and so wanted to introduce his 6 great disciples to him, perhaps making Brain owe him a favor in the process, so Brain's gratitude was not that great. The 6 great disciples were different on the other hand. Perhaps they had their interests piqued at the prospect of being able to train children that someone who could beat them handily, Brain, had judged had potential, or perhaps they were just interested in passing down skills to the children that they could use to survive. In any case, they were motivated to help the children without any ulterior motives from the start. Because he had been acting as the personal bodyguard of the princess, he had to come into contact with those annoying nobles. This was why people as straightforward as the 6 great disciples shone even brighter in his eyes. I do have to say that I was quite impressed by how magnanimous Mr. Unglaus really was. To have adopted these children and teach them skills so that they could survive. Brain's expression darkened. He hadn't done any charity that was worthy of such praise. Stop flattering me. I'm not that nice of a guy. While it's true that I picked these children up from the slums, it was for a purpose. There were ones that were on the verge of death, yet I still walked past them without lifting a finger to help. If you want to praise someone for their charity, do it to someone who actually deserves it, like the princess for example. He could see that the woman had a perplexed expression, but he wasn't sure what had caused it. Are you talking about Princess Renner-sama? About how she had funded her orphanage? It's true that the princess had done something extraordinary, but I believe that Mr. Brain had also accomplished what no other person could. Aren't you both equally worthy of praise? Doesn't look like I could get through to you. Think whatever you want to, but don't do it in front of me. I'd have heartaches from the guilt alone. Then I do apologize. No, don't think too much about it, it was a joke. I'm not innocent enough to feel guilt from something so small. Brain shifted his gaze away from the shocked expression on her face and looked towards Gazefstranov's, now Brain's, residence. His thoughts were of the children who had just had their fill and were probably sleeping right now. In a room on the 9th floor of Nazarick, approximately a month after the war was declared. In one of the rooms that was reserved for potential new guild members were Ins and the floor guardians. They sat around a C-shaped desk, reading through the documents prepared for this meeting. As a side note, it wasn't just the floor guardians who were there. Behind each of them stood an equal number of ordinary maids, and behind Ins stood Pestonia. They were there to take care of the occasional odd job and thus stood silently behind them all. Ins could not grasp the reasoning behind why they were silent. Apparently it was to symbolize that they were tools, ready to be used. For that reason, Ins paid them no attention at all to satisfy their wishes. Ins read the documents in earnest, but felt as though his focus was being sapped away by Pestonia's presence behind him. Still, he tried to focus his attention on the task as best as he could. Since they had to exchange their opinions on the subject matter later on, it was natural for Ins to have anxious thoughts such as, how embarrassing it would be if I were to say something crazy later on. In any case, this was different from the documents that Albedo usually sent from Nazarick regarding topics such as politics, economics, and law. This was something that even someone like Ins could understand. Even with the utmost amount of kindness, Ins's intelligence could only be judged as average at best. To ask someone to find the qualities within him that would qualify him to rule over a country would be to impose unto them the impossible. That was not to say that he was lazy. In fact, he was the diligent type to try his best at everything that was thrown at him. This was further exacerbated by the misunderstandings held by the NPCs of Nazarick, whose intelligence was incomparably higher than his. In order to meet their expectations, Ins could not afford to be lazy. At first, he was doing so out of his desire to keep the NPCs loyal, but now it was more out of his desire as a father figure to not disappoint his children. It had come to a point where he was reading books on self-development and business. He had also been trying his best to improve himself in combat tactics, one of the only subjects he could claim expertise in. Though it was safe to leave everything up to Albedo and the rest, there were still a lot of things that they found to be necessary to consult with Ins. If he were to say anything stupid when that time comes and they were to respond with, as Insama wills, it shall be done, and take immediate action, it could cause serious collateral damage. To avoid that outcome, Ins's personal growth was imperative. Because of this, Ins had taken a particular interest in this document and was even more focused on it than he would have usually been. Ins, upon finishing most of it and confirming that the appointed time had come, said, "Now then. Has everybody finished reading?" "Yes, Insama." As their representative, Albedo took a glance at everybody and replied, "Excellent. Now wait, before that. Though it has been a month since we declared war against the kingdom, they have not noticed our invasion at all. They must still think that our forces are still holed up in Irantal. Demiurge, good job. Your ability to deftly manage everything so that not a single piece of intel was leaked was seriously impressive. I'm grateful to receive my master's compliments. On the same note, to have threatened a portion of the kingdom's nobility into rebelling was also a splendid accomplishment, Albedo. Thank you very much, Insama." Albedo, like Demiurge, lowered her head. This current matter is of greater importance, so report to me in detail about what you have done after this." Ins knocked on one of the pages in the document with the back of his finger and confirmed that the both of them had understood what he had meant. He nodded in a fashion that suited his status as Overlord and scanned the guardians before him. Though the maids who were within his sideline were looking towards him with serious eyes, he resisted the urge to pay attention to them. "Very well then, let us exchange our opinions on this matter. First of all, the fact that we were able to conquer cities even when this tactic was employed pleases me greatly. Cocytus, you've done well. I am grateful for my master's praise. But this was only possible because of the undead army Ins Sama had lent me that eyes to say that this was Ins Sama's accomplishment. It would not be incorrect to say that I did nothing. It is just as Cocytus has said." Ins extended out his hand to stop Albedo before she could finish her sentence. "There is no need to flatter me. Cocytus, just candidly accept my appreciation. I have said as much, you've done a great job this time." "Yes. Thank you very much. Excellent. Now then, we have been able to subjugate the kingdom's cities without any trouble at all. At the onset of the war between the Source-Rouse kingdom of Ins-Oulgaun and the kingdom, they had adopted the tactic to attack the eastern part first and then march towards the north. The western side of the kingdom where the capital resides was not marched upon at all. The main purpose of this tactic was to prevent reinforcements from other nations from interfering with the war, and to encircle the kingdom by gaining control over the border with the council state and others. This was Cocytus' strategy, a move that Ins himself also considered to be exceptional. I have found this result to be more than satisfactory. Now then, Demiurge and Albedo, regarding the information lockdown, the report indicates that it is highly likely that that plan will succeed. My question is, under what condition will it fail? Demiurge, answer me as their representative. Yes. We have fully established surveillance on every street. We have also sent shadow demons to scout out the neighboring cities. But, if there are hermits or druids, people who live outside of civilization, we would not be able to keep an eye out for them. If information were to leak, it would be from them. Then discuss the matter with Albedo, strengthen the surveillance net until those you have mentioned can also be found. Yes. Now then, next is in switched documents and continued flipping. Bumu, a few cities have perished already, huh. Within these pages were exhaustive documentations on who used what strategy to completely destroy which city. The most recent entry was about a city that was destroyed by Ch2. To fearlessly attack a city with a small force, flawlessly destroy the city, and butcher all of its inhabitants. Just like Ch2 had done, the rest of you have also thought up various kinds of ways to conquer city after city and village after village. I am truly impressed. The Sorcerer's kingdom had initiated a brutal war in which their policy was to completely destroy every city and village in their way and massacre all of its inhabitants. All that was left behind after the Sorcerer's kingdom army's unanticipated attack was lifeless piles of ash and rubble. Speaking of which, Ins had suddenly become more conscious of someone's gaze, which should have been fixated on him. He wasn't doing these horrendous and ruthless acts because he wanted to. There was a purpose behind them. Hopefully she could come to understand it, Ins thought to himself. Thank you very much, Insama. Albedo lowered her head, prompting the other floor guardians to follow suit. To meet Insama's expectations from this day forward, we will devote ourselves wholeheartedly to making improvements. Ah, Bumu. I gratefully accept every floor guardian's determination and loyalty. Next is. That's about it, right? Ins faked a cough and continued. But, I am concerned that none of you have failed. Before the guardians could react with their baffled expressions, Ins added. Ch2, you tasted defeat during the battle with the lizardman. I assume that you learned a lot from that experience. It is just as Ins Sama has surmised. I learned a lot from that experience. That was what I was talking about. You learn more from your failures. No, I'd argue that there are some lessons that could only be learned from failures. This was true back in Yggdrasil. One would only think of how they could improve if they were to lose. Job resets, different equipment, and new tactics. If one were to always win, they would become complacent, numb, and careless. They would have lost their drive to self-improve. Though there were exceptions to this rule like Touch Me-san. He had not experienced defeat all that often yet continually strived to become stronger. A man who sought out the best job synergies to min-max his performance to the point of obsession, should be considered an outlier when thinking of the average player. Putting those exceptions aside, Ins believed that there existed some things that you could only learn through defeat. That was why he was hoping for some failures in their city-conquering efforts. This was a part of the plan where failures would not have mattered much, they could retry as many times as they wanted. They had to be prepared for a future battle that was bound to happen, one in which if they were to lose, it would amount to a complete defeat. They had to fail now to build up enough experience in order to avoid failing when that time comes. Since they were incurring a massive loss of life, it had to result in Nazarick gaining some form of a benefit. That's right, the lives lost should be used in the most beneficial way possible. There was one other thing. Ins decided that he should make preparations for this after he had heard the wishes of those two. Let's go, this next thing will determine whether I've won or lost. Those who are wise, he couldn't think of what to say after that. He had forgotten the script he had prepared. Forget about that. Those who are stupid, learn through their experiences. Now I'm not saying that you all are stupid, but I am pointing out the fact that even idiots could understand the necessity of collecting experiences. Ins was disappointed in himself. Why did he forget what he wanted to say during this crucial moment? Why was he this useless? Why were those who were well spoken also smart? How were they able to spew out the words and phrases they had learnt non-stop? Usually, even if someone were to forget what they were about to say, they wouldn't stop there, would they? There was only one probable conclusion: their brains were built differently. No matter if we were to destroy the kingdom's cities or massacre its citizens, it is not too much of a hassle given the great underground tomb of Nazarik's power. But, our focus should be on accumulating experience. If we were to face a much more difficult situation, the lessons you have learned from this war could be of help. INS had experience launching attacks on enemy bases and sieging cities during past guild wars and other similar events. However, that was back in Yggdrasil. The knowledge that he had gained from the game must be implemented in reality properly. In that context, the experience they had gained from the different methods they had employed to destroy different types of cities will undoubtedly be of use in the future. The great underground tomb of Nazarik had to strengthen itself. The belief that INS Olgaun and the great underground tomb of Nazarik were the only guild and guild base in this world was a naive one. INS exists in this world, therefore there must be other players and guilds in this world too, perhaps due to arrive in the future. To prepare for that future, it was a necessity for this organization to bolster its own strength. Indeed, it was imperative for all of them to have personal experiences in these matters. INS continued on to the guardians who were intently listening to him. Speaking of our current situation, I could feel that the burden of responsibility has been growing ever so heavier on every floor guardian. At the same time, the number of people like you who I could entrust these jobs to are far and few between. The floor guardians excluding Victim were all strong level 100 beings that could give INS a run for his money. The area guardians were weaker than the floor guardians, so INS felt uneasy at the suggestion of bringing them outside, where there could be strong enemies. This was why the number of tasks given to the floor guardians had been increasing. However, if we were to keep up the status quo, multiple issues will begin to surface. When the Source Rouse Kingdom of INS Olgaun has come to subjugate a vast enough territory, the area guardians will take up responsibility for a wide range of tasks. Perhaps a day will come when even the management of warfare will have to be delegated to someone. That is to say that our master wishes those who are without experience to have a personal history of their own, correct? Demiurge started spouting unintelligible things again. But, what he said about forming a history of their own more or less hit the mark. It sounded pretty cool too. That's correct. It is just as you have surmised, Demiurge. Though he did not feel as though it could be conveyed properly, INS still smiled while using his practiced what a no-nonsense ruler would sound like, voice. Speaking of which, normally if he were to hear himself using that voice through a recording he would not be able to stand the amount of cringe he felt, but he didn't really think too much about it now. After all, he felt that his emotions would get suppressed quickly if he had imagined the voice that he was using. Anyways, Demiurge's history idea was a good one. They had gained the knowledge of various types of methods to siege cities during this invasion against the kingdom, and they should record all of it down in a book or something. With the area guardians as their focus, the denizens of the great underground tomb of Nazarik should be able to gain some knowledge through these shared experiences, right? Of course, as the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Those who had experienced something firsthand could learn more from it than those who had only heard about it afterwards. However, he felt that they would not be able to have many more opportunities like this one. Now then, floor guardians, from this day onwards, try to come up with as many unique strategies to siege cities. Demiurge and Albedo, both of you are far too brilliant for this, so just listen and note down the others' proposals. From my perspective, up till now Ch2 has been the most creative in her strategies. I is in Sama talking about how I used the frost dragons to drop soldiers in from the sky Aransu. That is correct. I believe that it was because I had entrusted Ch2 with all the transportation related tasks that she was able to come up with that idea. With this tactic as the basis, we could organize, what was it called again? Paratroop. To be able to organize something like that isn't bad at all. She had not just used dragon breaths for hit-and-run tactics, but to drop Soul Eaters from 500 meters above into the city. The Soul Eaters would heal themselves, then rampage through the city killing masses with their aura. Even if it was Soul Eaters, to drop them from 500 meters up would inevitably incur some damage. In this world, acceleration due to gravity did not seem to be affected by air resistance, so one's free fall velocity could increase infinitely. That may or may not have been the case, but Ins did not want to spend the time and effort on that kind of experiment, so he did not have detailed information. Soul Eaters were able to activate an aura that consumed souls to convert them to HP, which meant that this strategy included a way to negate the fall damage taken by the units almost immediately. Though that plan was a failure in some aspects, but it was a good lesson to learn from for the future. Long story short, they were smashing through rooftops. Oro laughed as she read through the report, and Ins did the same in his mind. Of course, they were not laughing at Shaltier's strategy, it was just something that they had not expected, but was so obvious in hindsight. Of the Soul Eaters who were dropped from above, an individual bounced off some pointed rooftops, flew off at an odd angle, and took more damage than they had expected. That was still better compared to the one who smashed through the roof, tried to ram down the doors, and ended up getting stuck. Of the 4 that were dropped, only one of them wound up immobilized. The sample size was small, but the rate of failure ended up quite high nonetheless. It would be best to conduct this experiment a few more times. We may be able to gain valuable data from these dropped troops. Yes. I will leave it to you then. Choose a few cities to experiment on. As Insama wills it, I will draw up and execute those plans immediately. The other details that caught Ins's eye included how 300 Elder Liches were used to carpet bomb a city by synchronizing their fireball spells, and how assassins were sent to assassinate the head of a city, whereupon the invasion would commence whilst the city was plunged into chaos. These records on the methods they had used to destroy the cities were not just useful to educate the area guardians, but they were also useful as a study of what strategies an enemy could employ to invade Nazarick. Inside internally. Perhaps the guardians thought that he was being too paranoid. If Nazarick was truly invincible, there would be no need to do these things, but that could not be possible. Absolutely impossible. This is to prepare for our inevitable fight against a guild that is as strong if not stronger than us. After Ins had finished speaking, the guardians responded that they would obey in unison. Now then, it is about time that we begin our next siege. Ins glanced at Albedo because Ins did not have eyeballs. Most people could not notice that his gaze was on them. He had had to turn his head to face them most of the time, but Albedo was perceptive enough to notice without him doing so. Albedo nodded in a manner that seemed to convey the message, it is just as Insama has said. Speaking of which, Ins Sama, the amount of troops we have deployed for this war seemed to be scant. What was the reason for that? Ins immediately froze up. He could not think up an answer to such a logical question. To be honest, he thought he would be able to hold the stage much better than he was right now. Demiurge and Albedo had not been raising any questions. He had hoped that Cocytus and the rest would do the same too. So that's why. Because Cocytus had experienced defeat during the battle with the Lizardmen, I had instructed him back then to think for himself. No matter how you look at it, the source of his misery was always what he had said in the past. Why? No, what he had said back then was correct. From the perspective of him wanting to strengthen Nazarick, his statements were fine. It was because of what he had said back then that Cocytus could have the growth that he had today. Why did Ins arrange for an amount of troops that could not guarantee them victory? The explanation was not that complicated, but it wasn't one that he could just tell the floor guardians about. Why was that? It was because the explanation could bring about Nazarik's downfall. Ins gulped down his, non-existent, saliva. He had remained silent for too long. He had to say something, something that would seem to make sense. Speaking of which, it was the same when we were storming the neighboring towns and cities. A small portion of the people were allowed to escape, right? What was the reason for that? Cositas and Aura's questions were to be expected. Perhaps there are others amongst you who have had the same questions in mind. In surveyed those in front of him, to be met with every floor guardian nodding their heads. I see. Well, let us observe how our first battle will unfold. Afterwards, I will tell you the reason why. Ins was just dragging things out, leaving these bothersome problems for his future self.